Welcome back to the Real 411. I'm Dr. Chelsea McGee, and today we're pulling back the curtain on something that's been dominating the headlines but rarely gets the scrutiny it deserves: U.S. sanctions. Now, sanctions are always sold to us as these clean, surgical tools of justice, right? Like, we're just holding the bad guys accountable. But what happens when those sanctions are aimed at UN human rights officials? I've marched against apartheid, I've campaigned for divestment, and I know what real accountability looks like. These sanctions, they're something else entirely. So let's unravel this web of economic warfare, proxy conflicts, and digital crackdowns that's hiding beneath the headlines. Because as always, the story is never just the headline. Let's start with the latest flashpoint: the U.S. sanctions against Francesca Albanese, the UN Special Rapporteur for the West Bank and Gaza. Albanese has been a vocal critic of Israel's military actions in Gaza, and she's called out what she describes as genocide against Palestinians. Now, the Trump administration, specifically Secretary of State Marco Rubio, linked these sanctions to her support for the International Criminal Court, or ICC. The U.S. has already sanctioned ICC judges, so this is just the next step in a pretty aggressive campaign. The accusations against Albanese, they're heavy. Support for ICC prosecution of U.S. and Israeli officials, alleged anti-Semitism, and direct engagement with Palestinian advocacy. Rubio even accused her of political and economic warfare against the U.S. and Israel. But here's the thing: sanctioning a UN human rights official for doing her job, that's a whole new level. It shapes the international conversation on human rights and conflict accountability in a way that honestly feels more like silencing than justice. And as we've seen in past episodes, when you start targeting the critics, you're not just controlling the narrative, you're rewriting the rules of the game. Albanese didn't just stop at calling out governments, she went after the money. In her report, From Economy of Occupation to Economy of Genocide, she named 48 companies she says are profiting from the conflict in Gaza. We're talking about weapons manufacturers, financial firms, tech companies, the whole ecosystem that keeps the machinery of war running. She called for international sanctions on these companies, arguing that they're complicit in what she describes as war crimes. Now, I gotta say, this takes me back to my own activism days. I remember when we were pushing for divestment from companies tied to apartheid South Africa. The pressure campaigns, the late-night strategy sessions, the feeling that if you could just get enough people to care, you could actually move the needle. But here's the difference. Back then, the idea was to hold companies accountable, not to punish the people trying to expose them. Today, it feels like the script has flipped. Instead of supporting whistleblowers and investigators, we're sanctioning them. And that, to me, is a dangerous precedent. Now, let's zoom out a bit. The U.S. and Israel have been pretty clear. They do not want the International Criminal Court poking around in their business. When the ICC issued arrest warrants for Netanyahu and Gallant, the U.S. responded by sanctioning ICC officials, including prosecutor Karim Khan. That means freezing assets, banning travel, even threatening American staffers with arrest if they set foot in the U.S. The debate here is huge. Should international courts have authority over sovereign nations? On one hand, you want a system where no one is above the law, right? On the other, there's the argument about sovereignty and the risk of politically motivated prosecutions. I mean, I might be wrong, but it seems like if you're confident in your actions, you shouldn't be afraid of a little scrutiny. But the risks are real. If every time the ICC tries to hold someone accountable, they get sanctioned or threatened, what's the point of having an international court at all? It's a question that doesn't have an easy answer, but it's one we can't afford to ignore. Shifting gears, let's talk about the financial underbelly of all this, what the Treasury calls Iran's shadow banking network. The U.S. just announced a new round of sanctions targeting 22 entities in Hong Kong, the UAE, and Turkey. These aren't just random companies. They're front operations designed to help Iran sell oil and funnel the profits back to the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps and the Quds Force. The money moves through offshore accounts, dodging sanctions, and ends up funding weapons programs and proxy groups across the Middle East. The IRGCQF, in particular, has been a major player in regional instability, and the U.S. is trying to disrupt its funding at every turn. But here's the catch. Every time you close one loophole, another one pops up. It's like a never-ending game of financial whack-a-mole. And while the goal is to cut off the money that fuels conflict, the reality is that these networks are incredibly resilient. So, are we actually making a dent, or just forcing the system to get more creative? Now, if you thought sanctions were just about oil and banks, think again. The new frontier is digital, cyber operations, and venture capital. The U.S. recently sanctioned Song Kum-hyok, a North Korean cyber operative accused of masterminding a scheme where North Korean IT workers posed as Americans to get jobs at U.S. companies. The money from these gigs, it goes straight back to fund Kim Jong-un's weapons programs. And it's not just North Korea. In Silicon Valley, GVA Capital got hit with a $216 million penalty for managing investments for a sanctioned Russian oligarch, Suleiman Kerimov. Despite being warned, they facilitated deals that let Kerimov access U.S. tech and finance. So, are these sanctions actually deterring new forms of financial and cyber-enabled threats? I mean, sometimes it feels like we're always one step behind. The bad actors adapt, the money finds a new path, and the cycle continues. But if we don't keep up, we risk letting these networks grow unchecked. It's a constant arms race, digital, financial, and legal. Let's not forget the human cost. U.S. sanctions don't just hit governments and corporations, they impact real people, especially in conflict zones like Gaza and Syria. Humanitarian aid delivery becomes a logistical nightmare. Even with so-called humanitarian exemptions, aid groups struggle to get food, medicine, and fuel to those who need it most. The systems are so tangled that sometimes even the exemptions don't work. I've talked to folks on the ground who say they spend more time filling out paperwork and dodging red tape than actually delivering aid. So, what's the solution? International agencies and NGOs have to get creative, partnering with local groups, using alternative supply chains, sometimes even risking legal trouble just to keep people alive. It's a brutal irony. The tools meant to punish the powerful often end up hurting the powerless, and that's something we have to reckon with every single time we talk about sanctions. Now, let's talk about the other side of the coin. Diplomacy. Sanctions are supposed to be leverage, right? A way to bring people to the negotiating table. Sometimes it works. There are cases where sanctions have helped facilitate peace talks or forced a regime to make concessions. But just as often, they backfire, hardening positions, fueling resentment, and making compromise even harder. The key, I think, is using sanctions as part of a broader diplomatic strategy, not just as a blunt instrument. That means clear goals, regular reassessment, and most importantly, an off-ramp. If you're going to use sanctions, you need to know what success looks like and how to get there. Otherwise, you're just punishing for the sake of punishing. And as we've seen in so many conflicts, whether it's Iran, North Korea, or Gaza, sanctions alone rarely deliver lasting peace. They have to be paired with real engagement, real dialogue, and a willingness to listen, even to your harshest critics. All right, that's it for today's deep dive. If you want more fearless reporting on the power plays behind the policies, make sure you subscribe. And if you've ever wondered why some crimes never face a courtroom, share this episode. Let's get more people asking the hard questions. I want to hear your take. Are sanctions justice or just politics by other means? Drop a comment, send me your thoughts, and remember, here at The Real 411, the story is never just the headline. Until next time, keep questioning, keep fighting, and keep looking for the real story.